Conceptual incarceration. Yeah, conceptual, concepts, ideas, your mind, how you think, what you think about, ideas. Incarceration, yeah, to be jailed, to be controlled, to be chained. Yeah, obviously not free. So, how and what we think about as so called native and oppressed peoples really is the key to our freedom. Yeah, as Dr. Wade Nobles writes, yeah, that these erroneous concepts, ideas, views, opinions, and theories about who we are and who they are and about how we see the world, those definitions are really our domination. Right? So who gets to define, in essence, is who dominates. Right? So if we are imprisoned by ideas or concepts that have been imposed on our people, in essence, we are imprisoned in the way we think. And if our thinking is imprisoned, so are we as a people imprisoned. Many of the great minds like Kawai Puna Prejean, he used to always say, of course, we got to break the chains off our brains. It's not the chains on our legs we have to be worried about as much as the chains on our brains that we should be paying attention to. As Brother Skippy Ioan in his famous lines from his song, which goes something in the we're still pulling time in the prisons of our mind. That we have been led to believe somehow that we are free, but yet we are dominated and are still imprisoned by how we think as a people. So it's not just physically talking about escaping. If we do not have control of the way we think, by virtue of we controlling our definitions, then we will continue to be dominated by those who control those definitions. Yeah? And we will continue to be programmed in a way by the codes that they develop. And their coding, of course, is developed what purpose? But to maintain control and to expand control over our lives and our so-called lands, waters, and resources. So that process of indoctrination is not just to teach us what to think about, but is really to limit the way we think whereby we can only accept their definitions on what is important, what is conceivable, and really what is good. I mean, the idea that we should look to our oppressors to define for us what is morally right or wrong, what can be seen as being sacred or unsacred, or for them to define, in fact, who and should can be a Kanaka or be a Hawaiian, already provides and grants to them that power over us. Yeah, as great minds like Amos Wilson, he talks about that power of defining, that politics really is about the power to define. That the power to define goes hand in hand with domination. You have dominion over what you can define. And if I can have you buy into my definitions, in essence, I dominate you and your way of thinking. So even the idea of incarceration, when we are told over and over as Native peoples, the idea that we should somehow be fearful of we defining for ourselves our future, that somehow democracy or governmentality or freedoms or liberation or what is a so-called citizen, our sexualities, our definitions of maleness and femaleness, our definitions perhaps of what an economy can be, or how we should treat one another as human beings, that somehow that only they can define, and in somehow their definition is universal for all of us, that in itself is an act of domination. So an important element to relieve that domination of who we are as a people is really for us to redefine for ourselves. Yeah, so for we to redefine for ourselves the meanings of those so-called concepts. And we should always start with the meanings that come from our own language, concepts that come from our own cultural understandings of the world, and of course, of our own histories. Yeah, we should never, in fact, as people like Malcolm X and others have said, we should never allow them to tell us, to make their so-called heroes our heroes, for their histories to become our histories, for their ideas of morality to become ours. Because if we allow that definition to impose on us, in essence, we are allowing those chains on our brains. So an important element to remove those chains is for us, the so-called native and oppressed peoples who struggle against domination, is to first for us to realize that domination. And much of that domination has been our acceptance of their defining, their control, and of course their domination via this important incarceration, again, controlling the way we think. Foucault, the great French philosopher, also has that idea of to define is to delimit. That idea, of course, is he or she that defines is an expression of power. Anytime you define something, it's about limiting who is privileged and who isn't. Think about in the Hawaiian Homelands Act of 1921, the idea of when they created this identity of what becomes a native Hawaiian small n, where you had to be 50% blood quantum. That is nothing to do with our history, has nothing to do with our cultural views, has nothing to do, in fact, who we are as a people. This was something that was imposed upon our people, whereby it became something real to this day, where you have Hawaiians who have become, in their brainwashed, in their programming, come to accept this as being something real. There is no such thing as a 50% blood quantum native Hawaiian small n. But there are those who can benefit from that certain way of seeing the world. Not because it's good for us, you gotta understand, because it was good for the so-called occupier in Hawaii to benefit from delimiting who we are, and for them defining for us who we are. So an important element for so-called native peoples is to start by, of course, defining for us who we are as a people, defining for us our history. We do not have any moral reasoning to somehow believe that we must convince them to accept our history. It is for us to teach our history, our languages. It's for us to define our ideas of gender, our ideas of sexuality, our ideas of what a family is, our ideas what property is, perhaps, our ideas what is culturally relevant, our ideas of what is sacred. Because once we continue to acquiesce and allow those so-called foreigners and oppressors to define for us, we will never be free. We can only be free if we can define for ourselves our reality. See, that's the important part of conceptual incarceration. It is us, through our own cultural views, through our own histories, through our own relationships, that we must reclaim that control of the power to define. For us to define